So he's going to use the Marines. But wait, aren't they busy fighting at the moment? Pretty desperate fighting. Okay, can they be in two places at once? Ah, I see the problem. Yeah, okay. September 3rd, 1950. Desperation can provoke you into doing many things. It can also provoke your entire army into doing things. Like, if you realize that if things remain as they are, you will lose. So instead, you launch a massive offensive with everything you have left, attacking literally everywhere along the whole battlefront all at once. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, Allied planes accidentally bombed Mao Zedong's communist China. UN Commander Douglas MacArthur wrote a speech that implied Taiwan should never be returned to Maoist China. He also had a meeting where he tried to convince loads of top brass that his plan to land troops in the North Korean rear will win the Korean War. And the war continued as it does every week in the field, though with the UN forces winning the Battle of the Bowling Alley. Also last week, 2 battalions of the British 27th Infantry Brigade under Basil Coed set sail from Hong Kong for Pusan to join the fight. They arrived this week. However, they do so with no field ambulance, without most of their own transport or a field ordnance stores unit, no sleeping bags, without a bunch of stuff. See, for now, transport and maintenance are to be provided by the U.S. Army. Also, despite the volunteers I mentioned last week, they are under strength, although they do have an anti-tank battery with 17-pounder guns with them. They also have picked up the nickname the Woolworth Brigade because of their shortcomings in equipment and clothing. The brigade arrived at Pusan on the 28th of August, the first United Kingdom contingent to be subjected to the standard Pusan welcoming routine. A black U.S. Army band giving a superb rendition of the St. Louis Blues March, troops of well-drilled Korean schoolchildren waving Union flags and singing a barely recognizable version of God Save the King, and ladies in colorful Korean national dress festooning the embarrassed Coad with flowers. When the pipes and drums of the Argylls marched off the ship, the crowds were suitably awestruck. These first United Nations troops to arrive were not only much appreciated as a sign of solidarity, the bearing and evident discipline promised well for the future. However, there are a lot of differences between American staff procedures and their own, and things like artillery support using totally different radio procedures and units for calling in or adjusting fire. So a lot has to be learned quickly because this is very much a crisis point in the war. And these men are needed in the field as soon as possible. In fact, although Coad was promised time upon arrival to get his men up to speed and get them trained with the American 3.5-inch bazooka, the big new North Korean offensive September 1st means they are to be sent into the lines. In a few days, they will take over a section of the front on the far left of U.S. 1st Cavalry Division in front of Daegu, in charge of around 15 or 16 kilometers of front, which is pretty large for 2 fairly weak battalions, 1 platoon of tanks, and 2 artillery batteries. U.S. 5th Air Force has given them a tactical air control party, though, which is great because then at least they'll have direction over any airstrikes they'll need to call in. Wait. There's a big new North Korean offensive? I'll get there. By the end of August, the United Nations forces had a large superiority of manpower, nearly 180,000 against less than 100,000 enemy. They held the air uncontested, and the sea as well. 8th Army had absolute and overwhelming superiority in artillery and mortar fire, and could face the 100 remaining tanks of the Inmun-gun with some 600 American main battle tanks. By August 31st, the enemy had only one thing in his favor. He still held the initiative. The Inmun-gun is the North Korean Army, the KPA. The fighting in August, with the UN forces all pressed into the Pusan Perimeter, was quite different from that of July. In July, and late June, it pretty much never varied, and it never had to. There would be a frontal attack to pin down the Americans or the ROK, the South Koreans, and at the same time would come flanking attacks and infiltration of troops into the rear. Since the UN forces could not establish a hard battle line, this worked great time after time after time. But in the Pusan Perimeter, there is such a line now. Thin, yes, but there. The flanks are resting against the Sea of Japan and the Korea Strait. So they're solid. And those same tactics, in August, have produced costly failures. The KPA has by now realized that maybe the only way to destroy the perimeter and win is a frontal attack to break through, not pin down, break through the enemy and then exploit his rear before he can mobilize his reserve. But this is, for once so far this war, the kind of war the American troops have actually learned how to fight. This they know how to defend against. In pushing the Americans into a corner, the NKPA probably made its greatest tactical error. For, more lightly armed than the Americans, it had poor odds of smashing the American forces with direct hammer blows. By late August, the Inmun-gun was bleeding to death. Its combat efficiency was lower than at any previous time. It had lost irreplaceable tanks, guns, and veterans of the China Wars. At least 1/3 of its strength now was composed of inductees from South Korea, many of whom had no weapons, training, or inclination to fight for unification communist style. It's pretty impressive that they get any supplies at all, considering UN aerial superiority, but they still have gotten ammunition and gasoline, although what they did get came at the expense of other stuff like clothing and medical supplies. And food. Many units have only enough for 2 meals a day, sometimes just 1. So by now, hunger is a real issue. So North Korean High Command knows they have to win quickly if they're going to win at all. So, North Korean Operations Director Marshal Choi Yong-gun and Vice Premier General Kim Chaek have been planning a huge attack to go off this week on September 1st. The Big Hail Mary, with 13 infantry divisions and 1 armored one and 2 more armored brigades. We've seen the divisions being whittled slowly down over the weeks. So the infantry divisions have from 5 to 9,000 men. The armored division, 1,000 men, and the brigades, 500 each. They do have around 100 new Soviet T-34 tanks that just arrived. And altogether, Choa has just under 100,000 men for this offensive. A powerful force. The orders went out already last week on the 20th. In the south, 6th and 7th divisions are to break through U.S. 25th Division. 4 divisions are to defeat U.S. 2nd Division around Miryang and then break through the Daegu-Pusan road at Yongsan. 3 more will attack near Daegu, breaking through U.S. 1st Cavalry and 1st ROK divisions. East of Daegu, it'll be taking out ROK 8th and 6th divisions, and then towards the east coast, 5th and 12th divisions will continue, as we've seen, attacking the ROK capital, and 3rd divisions taking Pohang-dong and down to Gyeongju. Basically, there will be more force hitting the Naktong River section of the perimeter, but Cho will be putting some serious pressure pretty much everywhere, figuring that something's got to give and somewhere will break. Well, 2 days ago on the morning of September 1st, it really gets going. I'm going to cover some of the attacks the final few days of the week, but I'll talk more about this next week because there are attacks all around and the general situation is dire for the UN forces. As happened a few weeks ago, a very serious threat to the UN forces develops in the Naktong Bulge, where the 20,000 men of Pak Kyo-sam's North Korean 9th Division attack U.S. 9th Infantry Regiment's front. His division officer's directive says, flank and destroy the enemy through capture of the Miryang and Samnangjing area, thereby cutting off 8th Army's withdrawal route between Daegu and Pusan. Even just the last couple days of the week, they nearly succeed in this, for the 9th Infantry holds a front of 20 kilometers, so its companies are scattered on the hilltops. The North Koreans crossed the river at several points, and already early the first day have taken Cloverleaf Hill and No Name Ridge. Remember the fight for those 2 weeks ago? The KPA are soon swarming across the land, and west of Yongsan, the American defenses have been broken. 9th Infantry are not the only ones from U.S. 2nd Division in trouble. By mid-morning the 1st, Dutch Kaiser, divisional commander, realizes his division has been split in 2, with the 9th Infantry to the south and the 23rd, who have a company overrun, and the 38th, who have yet to be hit, to the north. Kaiser gets intel that North Korean 2nd Division has also crossed the river and are in 23rd Sector. By noon, 8th Army headquarters knows a hole has been torn in 2nd Division, 11 kilometers deep and 10 wide. Communications at the front are poor to non-existent, and some frontline units are disintegrating. But 8th Army Commander Walton Walker has a huge decision to make. See, further to the south, 25th Division is also in major trouble. Walker has 3 regiments, weakened ones, in his reserve at the moment. The enemy is nearly at Yongsan though, just like 18 kilometers from Miryang and the rail and road lines that hold the perimeter together. So 2nd Division gets priority. Walker asked 5th Air Force to make its strikes in front of 2nd Division and also behind the enemy to prevent any reinforcements from coming across the river or supplying the North Korean spearheads. Naval units are also to support here, and the 5th Marine Brigade, now at Masan, is to head for the Bulge. Walker himself heads to 2nd Division's front. North Korean troops enter Yongsan that night. The 9th Infantry fights back, of course. In fact, they fight back well, and by late afternoon the 2nd, the KPA has been driven from the town, or more accurately, village. Or more accurately, the remains of where a village stood a few days ago, because that's what it is. That drive at least has been stopped, and today the 3rd, the Marines join the fray, attacking towards Cloverleaf Hill and Obongni Ridge, no-name ridge. The 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marine Brigade, with the 2nd Battalion from the 9th Infantry to their north, manages to push the KPA back to a line about 3 kilometers west of Yongsan. And torrential rains begin to fall when darkness does. Now, North Korean 2nd Corps' general attack in the east begins the 2nd, but we saw 12th Division attack at the end of last week, taking Gigya. In fact, as this week starts rolling, ROK 2nd Corps is on the point of collapse. Walker appoints John Coulter, his deputy commander of 8th Army, and he creates and assumes command of Task Force Jackson, which is ROK 1st Corps, U.S. 21st Infantry, and a couple of attached units, headquartered in Gyeongju. North Korean advances the next few days mean that he concentrates force in an arc around the town. But by today, not only does he hear that ROK 3rd Division is preparing to withdraw from Pohangdong on the coast, but this evening, ROK 1st Corps begins to collapse. In fact, there are penetrations and offensives everywhere on the perimeter that begin at various points this week, but next week, a week of serious action, I will do some backtracking to pick them up and show you just where we are in the days before Incheon. Incheon, you ask? What's Incheon? Last week, overall UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur had the big meeting to convince all and sundry among the powers that be that his big plans for an amphibious assault on the port city of Incheon in mid-September is the masterstroke they are looking for. I'd like to say a few more words about that, though I've gone over a bunch of issues already. Okay, geography. Not geography around Incheon, but South Korean geography in general. As the KPA has driven southward, they've been forced to deal with the physical reality of the land. In the far east, the coastal roads have been strained just by the division or so marching down them, and the roads in the mountains are few and far between, and not much good anyhow. So by default, the main supply artery of the KPA in the south of the peninsula goes from the western part of the north through the bottleneck of Seoul. Even supplies from places like the North Korean east coast port of Wonsan have to also go down through Seoul and catch the railway from there down towards Pusan because they don't have a direct rail to Pusan. The vast majority of the support for the communist offensive, therefore, funneled through the fairly narrow corridor in and around the capital city. To overrun South Korea, the communists had to go out on a long limb. And the farther out they got, the thinner the limb became. As the perimeter firmed up in the south and the line stabilized, that supply limb was increasingly battered by United Nations air power, but it was not broken. The communists might have to move by night, hide their trains in tunnels, conscript huge numbers of local peasants for road and rail repair, but they kept on doing it. Air power had slowed them, but it had not stopped them. That is what the Incheon plan is supposed to do. But who exactly is to do this? Well, 10th Corps has been established under Edward Almond for the operation, and that is the 7th Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Division. But the operation is scheduled for less than 2 weeks from today, and the Marines are fighting in the Pusan Perimeter and fighting hard. And 7th Division has repeatedly had units taken from it for reinforcing units in Korea, and does have a lot of Korean civilians drafted in to make up some of the difference. I talked about MacArthur last week as well with regard to China. and a big kerfuffle that was stirred up because he publicly expressed views that don't really toe the line of Truman's government's views in general. It would be a mistake, however, to overemphasize the differences between MacArthur and Washington at this point. In condemning appeasement of Chinese communism, MacArthur was attacking a straw man. The administration might not back the return of Chiang to the mainland, but it was moving towards the permanent denial of the island to Beijing. MacArthur's greatest crime was to state publicly what was being implied privately in Washington. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin is a bit concerned by MacArthur's position, and he suggests that the Taiwan issue be put before the UN, that the General Assembly could set up a committee, and that it would decide when the Pacific had returned to a stable state of peace and security, and then under the terms of the old Cairo Declaration, Taiwan could be seceded to China, to Mao Zedong's Communist China. Going to quote MacDonald again here. This would get U.S. insistence on neutralization while reassuring India and China about the long-term future of the island. Beijing would be given an incentive to refrain from military action at the Straits or in Korea. While agreeing to study the idea, Atchison refused to confirm the Cairo Declaration. There was strong pressure against handing Taiwan over at any future stage. The Joint Chiefs of Staff described it as strategically important, irrespective of the situation in Korea. Atchison himself always argued that it was one thing to cede the island to China, and another to give it to a regime which was an arm of the Moscow conspiracy. He wanted to encourage a liberal alternative to Chiang and an independent Taiwan, guaranteed by the UN. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff objected that a UN commission might give the island to Beijing, Atchison replied that the question would be settled on terms agreeable to Washington. And I hope that it is agreeable to you that here I end this week of the Korean War, with the North launching offensives everywhere in a desperate try to win the war before a giant steamroller can be fully assembled opposite them. Douglas MacArthur trying to circumvent even that by attacking them from the rear, and ever more issues with China. You know, this week on the 1st, Truman addresses the nation to make sure everyone understands just what his position is on China and things, and what his views are on the general situation. He talks about North Korean aggression and how the Americans and the UN have responded so far. But then he goes on to say, the Koreans have the inalienable right to be free, that he absolutely does not want this growing into a larger conflict, that he certainly does not want China being misled into joining the war with the North, that the US does not want to take Taiwan or any part of the Asian mainland, and that he very much believes in the United Nations. This is what he closes with, which I too will close with today. We believe in freedom for all the nations of the Far East. We do not believe in aggression or preventative war. Our men are fighting today for peace in Korea. It does seem like things are coming to a head with the big North Korean offensive and the big plans for the Incheon operation. I will be here to cover it all, thanks to the Time Ghost Army. That is what allows us to do all of this. These are the newest officers in the Army, and the Army member of the week is Thomas A. Dry. We get good names lately, don't we? Yeah? Thomas A. Dry. You too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And speaking of amphibious attacks, we did an entire channel called D-Day 24 Hours, which covers the events of that day in real time in 24 episodes covering 1 hour each, right? You can check out episode 1 right here. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next week.